Welcome to Patient Empowerment Network. I am Lisa, your Myeloma Network Manager here at Penn. We are starting a Myeloma Path to Empowerment program this month. As multiple myeloma patients, we are certainly not lucky to have myeloma, but we are fortunate to have a vast network of excellent resources for myeloma. As one of those resources, we do not want to reinvent the wheel, but we'd like to hopefully try to provide a different type of format for myeloma patients to gather information and inspiration. One of my favorite resources is our local myeloma support group. I look forward to it every single month. We share information and a lot of stories that are sometimes not the type of stories that you want to talk to your doctor about or even have the time to talk about. This new patient panel format that we're piloting will feel more like those patient conversations that we typically have at our monthly meetings. We hope you'll feel our support and feel empowered with what we and hopefully you share during this program. Before we get started, I need to cover a little bit of housekeeping with a disclaimer. This Patient Empowerment Network program is solely based off of patient experiences and is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice. Please consult with your physician or qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding your medical condition. If you have any questions for our patient panelists, please leave them in the chat box or use the Q&A function on Zoom. We have a producer behind the scenes and our panelists will be available to answer your questions at the end of the program, so stay tuned. Okay, first of all, thank you to Sherry, Craig, and Jack for being here to share their experiences and to answer some questions as myeloma patients. I will let each one of them do a brief introduction.
I was diagnosed in October of 2011, so I'm coming up on 10 years. I'm very excited about that. And I have standard risk capillite chain multiple myeloma, so no high risk markers for me. I did induction therapy. I had a stem cell transplant in March of 2012 and stayed off treatment, no maintenance, because I was also on dialysis when I first got diagnosed because the myeloma had damaged my kidneys. So I didn't do any maintenance therapy. 2 years after my transplant, I did have to start therapy again, and I was on that therapy for 6 years. Then I had to change last July. I had to change therapy again. And I'm currently on Darzalex Revlimid, and I've been on that a little over a year now. And so I would say that I'm in active treatment, and it relapsed last year, but right now I'm stable. And as far as my advocacy, obviously I'm a support group leader and here in our area, and I'm hopefully, very involved with the International Myeloma Foundation. I also like to take part in other groups like Patient Empowerment Network. So that's me.
Sounds great. Thanks, Sherry. Yes, Sherry is our support group leader here in the Boise and surrounding area. She's very energetic and devoted to that cause, so we really appreciate her here in Boise. Craig has also completed extensive research on the best options for specialists, for which he has a lot of knowledge. He's quite knowledgeable, and also for treatment options for himself.
Yes, I was diagnosed in August of 2017. I went in for just my routine annual physical exam. And my doctor noticed that my total protein was ticking up every year and decided to do a further test. Got a call from my doctor's office, and he said, I need to refer you to a hematologist oncologist. And I knew that wasn't a good sign. So that led to many more tests, blood tests, urine tests, full body scans, and ultimately a bone marrow biopsy. And the hematologist oncologist told me that I had what is known as smoldering multiple myeloma. A precursor to active myeloma. So that happened in August of 2017. They continued to monitor me monthly from there forward. And in March of this year, my smoldering turned to active. So I now moved to where I'm getting treatment. I just finished my 7th cycle of treatment, and it's going very well. I have IgG lambda multiple myeloma. I have I guess an intermediate risk factor in mine. I do have a 1Q addition, one extra copy of that. So that does lead into some treatment options that may be different than others. So my treatment right now is I decided to go with a quad 4 drug combination. in my treatment. So I've been being treated with daratumumab, Revlimid, Velcade, and dexamethasone. So like I said, I'm just finished cycle 7. Because of COVID, I was supposed to go to a transplant. That's been postponed for about a month. That'll probably happen in October. So next week, I'll start my 8th cycle and then hopefully go to a transplant.
Thanks, Craig. So Jack, who is a myeloma advocate and educator extraordinaire. A lot of people in the myeloma community know Jack for all of it, the energy and time he puts into advocacy and educating himself and others with myeloma. Jack is also a member of our board of directors here at Penn. So Jack, you please describe your diagnosis and where you're at with your treatment and your myeloma.
Sure, Lisa. I was diagnosed early 1995. So for all you non-mathematicians, that's coming up on 27 years. When I was diagnosed, it was considered stage 3, and I had significant treatment the first 8 years of diagnosis. It included lots of chemo, 3 transplants, including the final one being a full allogeneic transplant. It included 2 clinical trials, too many rounds of radiation. But I finally got into a good remission back in 2002 and have not been on any active treatment since then. Advocacy-wise, I facilitate our San Francisco Bay Area support group, as well as I'm involved in research advocacy, working with different groups. SWOG is a consortium that develops clinical trials. NCI, National Cancer Institute, is involved in supporting and paying for clinical trials, and working with pharma companies as well to offer a patient perspective in the development of these trials.
Okay, thank you, Jack. And thanks to everybody for sharing the information about yourself and your diagnosis. For the record, I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, capital light chain myeloma, in April of 2018. I had been experiencing significant hip pain for about 2 years before I was finally diagnosed. I was diagnosed actually because I had a large plasmacytoma on my spine that was rapidly collapsing because of the plasmacytoma. I had to be treated first with radiation and spine stabilization surgery before they would even discuss the cancer. And since then, I've gone through induction therapy, 6 rounds of ARD. I had stem cells collected, harvested, and they are awaiting stem cell transplant for a later time. And I'm currently on Revlimid 10 milligrams a day. And so far my numbers are mostly stable 3 years in. So that's where I'm at with my diagnosis. And for anyone who is newly diagnosed and watching this, it might be a little confusing to hear the numbers and the genetic mutations being talked about. Your provider will probably discuss those with you. I am translocation 1114 and monosomy 13. Those are my genetic mutations. We tend to throw those around as patients, and you get more familiar with them as time goes on. So for anyone who's newly diagnosed, or even thinking back when you were diagnosed, your doctor says the word myeloma. You're in the office, your doctor says the word myeloma, and your world crumbles in that instant because he or she says myeloma, and then the word cancer. And then you hear things like bone marrow, fish studies, bone lesions, renal failure, and your head is just spinning and you're devastated. You're devastated to hear that. It's really hard to process all of that information. So against the advice of my provider anyway, and probably a lot of other people, I went out to my car. People sometimes go home, look it up, type in myeloma, and boom, there it is, blood cancer and the word incurable. And that's devastating for most patients. So for any of you can speak to this, but to hear the word myeloma or any cancer, it's a massive diagnosis to try to process. So if you go back in time and think about sitting in that doctor's office, because as patients, we sometimes don't have these discussions with our doctors, what was going through your head at that time? I think a lot of people have talked to me and said, what should I be thinking about or whatever? What went through your head at that time? And then a follow-up question to that is, once things started to sink in for you, when and how did you decide to talk to family and friends about this big diagnosis that really changed your world at that moment? Do any of you want to take a stab at that first?
So mine started off with a blood work that led to my doctor calling me and telling me that my kidneys were failing, that I needed to go to the emergency room. My kidneys were only functioning at 8%. I had no clue that anything was wrong with me. I felt fine. So that was kind of a shock. And I get to the hospital and they confirmed that, that wasn't a mistake. And pretty soon I'm talking to a nephrologist who's telling me I'm going to be on dialysis. We don't know we don't know why the kidneys are failing, but eventually I'm going to have to be on dialysis. So, and then he refers me to an oncologist. And within, 1 week from finding out my kidneys are failing, I also go to the oncologist office and he says, pretty sure you have multiple myeloma and we're going to do a bone marrow biopsy right here now. And so it was kind of like the 1-2 punch, my husband says. First we get punched in the gut telling me that I'm gonna have to go on dialysis. Then we get punched in the gut saying that we have cancer. And and then being told I would be on dialysis the rest of my life. Fortunately, that wasn't the case. After a couple of years, my kidneys had recovered barely enough to stop dialysis. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I've been off dialysis for almost 8 years. And we shared everything. I am an open book and I always have been. So we shared everything very quickly with our kids. We had 2 kids, 2 adult children, college age, living here, and 1 away at college. And we shared it with them and with our friends and with our family pretty much right away. That's just, just how we are. No sense in keeping it a secret. And we knew that would, eventually be a support system for us. And plus I was in the hospital for 3 days, which is highly unusual. So, people start to wonder what's going on. So we told everybody, right off the bat. And, but we had to explain it all to them because they had never heard of myeloma, just like we had never heard of myeloma.
How about you, Craig? Did you tell your family and friends right away, or did you have to think through the process, how you were going to do that?
So I had a long runway because I got diagnosed with smoldering multiple myeloma. And my doctors had told me that it's likely to smolder for at least several years, maybe longer than that. So, and they also told me that, other than going into a clinical trial, we're not going to treat you. And I had actually reached out to 2 specialists at that point in time who came to the same conclusion that it really wasn't something that needed to get treated. So I knew I had a long period of time. And my wife and I talked about it. I'm a very private person generally. So what we decided to do was share the information with immediate family members. Our 2 children, our parents, our immediate family knew that I had this precursor condition to a cancer that I had never heard about. And I explained a little bit about what this cancer was to them. I was continuing to work as I am now. At that point, I decided not to share it with friends and family other than my business partner until I was going to go into active treatment. And just for me personally, I knew that it was going to drive every time I met with some of these more acquaintance type people, that was going to be a topic of conversation. And because I had this long, hopefully multi-year runway, I didn't want to deal with that with my friends and colleagues at that point in time. So I did wait until I became active in March of this year. And that's when I basically told everyone we knew what was going on. And they've all been very supportive.
That's great. And Jack, your diagnosis was a while ago. Did you have kids at home when you were diagnosed?
I did. And yes, it was almost 27 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I had started off, like many myeloma patients, with significant back pain for 2 months. And I went to a back specialist who did the various scans, MRIs and x-rays, and didn't see anything. And towards the end of the 2 months, he took a blood test and then was going to do another diagnostic exam. And in that intervening weekend between those 2, my back stopped hurting, and it hadn't hurt in 27 years. And so I went to him and said, cancel that other test. And he said, and this is what blew me away. and I felt really good, right? So he says, well, you have an elevated protein. Of course, I feel really good. Can't have too much protein, right? And he continued on to say, which means you probably have a cancer. And that's when you stop listening. And he went on again to say, called multiple myeloma. And I remember only asking him two questions. One, how do I spell myeloma? And I actually made him write it on the back of a business card. And since I felt good, I also asked him, what's single myeloma? Maybe I don't have it as bad as whatever multiple myeloma is. And that was kind of that question went by the wayside pretty much. Now you have to remember back in 95, it wasn't like you could Google myeloma. In fact, it wasn't even clear that the internet would be surviving at that time. So after my diagnosis, I went to a neighboring medical library to look it up and confirmed what he said, that there was no cure and average lifespan was 2 or 3 years. And I was assigned a myeloma doctor, and the first treatment I had to have was a chemotherapy back then that required you to be in the hospital for 96 straight hours, getting a continuous infusion. So I had to say something to my kids then. They were 16, 14, and 10 at the time. And I thought that was probably the most difficult thing I had to do. You don't know what to say to children. And I just told them I had something wrong with my blood. And I still remember my 16-year-old daughter asking if I had cancer, which is hard for me to repeat even today. And I was VP of marketing for a company. We had taken the company public the year before. So I had to say something to the CEO there. I didn't know what the rules were in terms of SEC to make announcements and such. And in terms of friends, I met with a few of them, but contacted 2 of them who I knew would be great at spreading the word via email. And so I left it up to them. And I think it all worked out pretty well for me in terms of getting the word out. But I think it's a difficult thing that each patient has to consider and figure out what's best for them.
I think you're right, Jack. It's so different for everyone. I know Craig mentioned that he's more of a private person. It's hard to know how much to share, when to share, who to share with when you have kids, when you have colleagues, when your friends and neighbors see that you're maybe not doing so well or know that you're in the hospital, they want to know. But it really has to be a decision that is best for you and taking care of yourself during that time and your family at that time. So one of the things that kind of that flows into another question is when friends and family hear that, people jump in and they want to try to help. You get messages, phone calls, texts. How can I help? What can I do? How are you feeling? For me anyway, I loved that kind of support, but it does get overwhelming. And I know for anyone who has gone maybe to have stem cells collected or staging, when you're gone for several weeks at a time, it's really difficult to keep up on those messages, and everyone's intentions are so good and they really do want to help. So we had actually set up a Caring Bridge page where I could communicate on my own time, or my husband could communicate the information. So really, like you said, doing things on your own time and disclosing as much information as you want to. There was a patient who would ask me how to deal with a family member who, as they were talking about their myeloma, as she was explaining it to her family, that person got very choked up. And so she said, I felt like I was trying to take care of them as I was dealing with my own diagnosis. So I didn't really know exactly what to say other than just be sure to take care of yourself in that time. Whatever's right for you is going to be the best. Whatever's best for you is going to be the right thing for you. But the next question I had is when people do start asking, how can I help? Can I drive you to appointments? Can I bring meals to you? Maybe you want them to help out, which is a pretty easy one, but what if you don't want them to help out? Again, these are questions your doctors might not be able to answer, but they happen a lot with myeloma or cancer patients. How do you handle that when people are asking, either you don't have the time to respond, or maybe you don't want the help? Have any of you had that experience with your friends and family network?
Yeah, when I had a lot of people jump in and, offer meals or, whatnot, in the beginning, I accepted especially in the beginning when I was starting to, well, when I was in the hospital, too, I was doing my treatments, I was learning how to do dialysis. So the first 2 to 3 months were kind of hectic. And I had a friend who offered, she's like, every Wednesday, I'm going to bring you a meal. And I accepted that up until about like Thanksgiving. And I called her and I said, I'm back on my feet, you know, but I reserve the right next year when I have to have my stem cell transplant and be in the hospital again to ask you to help out again. And she says, definitely. And same thing with, you know, other friends. I was on a renal diet, so they want to know, what can we make for you? So you just tell them, but there does come a point in time where you say, I'm doing good now, but down the road, can I call you and ask you to help out again with meals? And then after my stem cell transplant, before I came home from the hospital, a group of friends were like, we want to come and clean your house. And I said, great. So they did come and clean my house. And that was, I have to say, that's uncomfortable because now they're like all over your house and you don't know what kind of state your house is going to be in because you've been in the hospital for almost 3 weeks. So you're a little embarrassed about the dust bunnies and how bad the bathroom might look. And, but it was welcome help, even though you might be a little embarrassed about how dirty your house really is. But I think that it was, for me, it was easier to say, I don't need the help right now, but next year or in a couple of months, if I need some help, can I call you then and ask for help? So that's maybe one way to, if you don't want the help right now, to still, you know, not totally shut them down, but say, I'd like to have some help in the future.
We also had a lot of people send notes asking, can I bring meals? A friend of mine set up a meal train for us for 6 months straight, 3 times a week. It was very hard to accept that. 3 times a week, we had meals brought to us. My daughters actually, who were teenagers at the time, have a list of their favorite recipes. And I said, we should make a myeloma cookbook from all the recipes people brought over. I didn't want to have people come over. And my friends would often say, put a sign on your door to say if you're tired, we won't ring the doorbell. I only had to do that one time because it wasn't the meals that I loved so much. I wasn't very hungry at the time. It was being able to see people at one time or 3 times a week, once a day, 3 times a week, for 5 minutes, just to say hello. And, you know, I could pull myself up and try to, you know, brush my hair and put on a little mascara and look sort of presentable. And it felt so good to see people and interact with them. But again, totally personal choice. If people don't want anyone to deliver meals, if you know, it's uncomfortable having people come into your home, a personal choice. You may not have even shared with those friends and family or coworkers everything that's going on. But Craig, you were more recently diagnosed. So have you, I'm sure you had people, once you started telling people, wanting to help somehow, what was your response to them?
Well, I'm blessed in that my primary caregiver is my wife. She drives me to every appointment. She takes copious notes at every appointment. She asks pressing questions to my doctors at every appointment, keeps track of my side effects, but is also the kind of the gatekeeper for all of our friends and families. They actually go to her rather than to me. And to date, we just haven't needed any physical help at all. But that likely will change once I get this transplant and we have to start social distancing even more than we've been doing with COVID. I mean, both Annette and me, when we get back here to Idaho. So I can see us reaching out to these friends and families who've been reaching out to us, wanting to help us throughout this whole process and having them do some errands for us at that point in time.
Good, yeah. And Jack, you're always helping other people. How were you at accepting help? Was that an easy thing for you to do when you were diagnosed or even now?
You know, I remember 2 really significant things that people did for me when I was first diagnosed. One of my friends offered to prune my fruit trees, which I gladly accepted. And another sent me an article on this thing called Iridia, which had just been approved of September of that year. And those were both important. And then my transplants, remember there were 3 of them, required me to be 2,000 miles away from home. I got my transplants in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I was at home, I was in Arkansas for typically 4 to 6 weeks at a time. And for most of that time, I had to have someone with me. And so on the occasion that it was my wife, she was the one that coordinated having the kids taken to school and make sure they had a place to stay that night and be fed. And that was help that was both necessary and certainly appreciated.
And I think all of us have found value in seeking out the opinion of specialists or getting second opinions on some of our treatments. Craig, you more recently have done that, and I know you have a lot of knowledge on the research that you've done. So can you describe what your process was? First of all, what your process was in trying to find a specialist and the value that you found in going to a specialist. We live in Boise, Idaho. We don't have any specific, we have hematologists, but no myeloma specialists here. So if you can maybe describe the value that you found in seeking out the care of specialists, that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah, like Lisa said, we don't have any myeloma specialists in town. It's just too small of a market, and so they just don't exist here. And once I started researching multiple myeloma, probably what I saw over and over again is, the survivability of patients that have a specialist is much greater than those that don't. I mean, this is a highly complex disease. It's different in every single patient from what I've researched. No two cases are exactly the same. The therapies also are highly complex. I mean, there are multiple drug combinations that the doctors put together. And so, what was important to me was I wanted to find a doctor who didn't have 5 or 10 myeloma patients. I wanted to find a doctor who had hundreds of myeloma patients, someone who specialized, researched, and basically lived their life in this world of multiple myeloma, which I didn't quite understand, but I knew that I needed somebody who really did understand it. And so, I asked my doctor, my local oncologist, who wasn't offended, who gave me some recommendations of people across the country. But I also went on Myeloma Crowd, and they had a directory of myeloma specialists. And so I went to that directory as a starting point. And the more research I did, for me personally, I wanted a doctor who was at a research facility that was doing clinical trials. So this doctor was doing some research, but also seeing patients, and hopefully a lot of patients. So my thought process was, if you have hundreds of myeloma patients and you're trying different drug combinations on these patients, they're probably going to figure out which patients are most similar to me and which drug combinations are working. And that's the kind of doctor I wanted, that had a lot of experience and was also doing some research, because these drug therapies are continually, they're changing day to day almost, or month to month anyway, and new drugs are coming out. So I wanted a specialist, like I said, who was up on the current research, was up on the clinical trials, was on a cutting edge, that could look at my specific case and be as aggressive as possible to try to get me into a long-term remission. And based on that, I also wanted a specialist that was close enough to Boise, Idaho, so I wouldn't have to travel for, say, more than an hour and a half on a plane to get there, because I knew I'd have to come see them from time to time. So that was my world. Reached out to 3 that looked, highly promising, had virtual visits with all 3 of them. They were all fantastic. And just based on that, selected my specialist, and we've been going on from there.
Oh, great. So you've narrowed it down to one specialist then that you're coordinate with your local oncologist then? Is that how that works?
Yeah, so I actually have one local oncologist and 2 specialists.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah. And then Jack, so was your specialist, when you mentioned going to Arkansas, was that a specialist that you saw there when you had your transplants? Do you ever speak with that physician? And then another question I have for you that you may or may not have the answer to. It's really great that some of us have the resources to go places to seek out the opinion of a specialist. If someone does not have those resources, do you have any suggestions on how they may access resources, whether it's financial or just support and how to find them?
So let me answer your first question initially. When I was diagnosed, I went through some of the same stuff that Craig just described, except that myeloma wasn't as well known, and there weren't specialists everywhere in the country like there are now. In the Bay Area, in fact, we didn't really have any myeloma programs like we have today, and where I would certainly be treated if I were diagnosed today. But at a support group meeting of myeloma patients, I learned about Arkansas, which turned out to be a center for myeloma research back starting in the early 90s, and to this day continues to be a myeloma center. So that's where I found my first myeloma specialist, and was treated there for the first 6 years until Stanford, my local center, brought on board a myeloma specialist, and he kind of did my follow-up treatment. Regarding folks who don't necessarily have the ability to travel far to see specialists, the first thing I'd say is use that myeloma crowd directory that Craig mentioned, and chances are you'll find a specialist pretty well close within the area that you live, certainly if it's any kind of urban or suburban area that you live in. If not, today we have tools like virtual connections where you can visit a specialist over your computer, and most are happy to do so. And the other thing I always found is that they are particularly happy to work with your local oncologist, not to necessarily push a treatment, but to give their advice. And if you have a good local oncologist, chances are they accept that advice. If they don't accept the advice, you may want to consider changing local oncologists, because you're talking to a myeloma specialist who's seen hundreds of patients compared to the local oncologist, hematologist, who might be seeing 1, 2, or 10 patients. And it's impossible, as Craig mentioned, to keep up with the research of an oncologist, of myeloma, for an oncologist who sees all types of different cancers. So it's awfully important to get that second opinion and then make that myeloma specialist part of your myeloma team.
And you mentioned the telemedicine visits, which during this time of COVID and using Zoom more frequently is a huge benefit. But if I was a newly diagnosed patient and I'm thinking, okay, I have my local oncologist, and maybe I want to contact somebody at Dana-Farber, a myeloma specialist, what is your suggestion for, would I just go online and look up Dana-Farber myeloma? How would I connect with a myeloma specialist?
Yeah, you would. Most of the centers these days, if you go to UCSF or Dana-Farber and such, have on their website a way to get second opinions. And I'd follow that process. Go to a support group. Maybe you'll learn about myeloma experts that are treating those support group members, and you'll want to follow up with them. Use your own oncologist, hematologist to perhaps get a referral if they're real familiar with the myeloma area and such. So there are ways. Okay. Ask me.
Well, thank you, Jack. We appreciate that. And you also mentioned the support groups. If you can access a support group, even if you don't have one in your area, I know both Sherry and Jack would know how to get you in touch with a support group somewhere, even if it is joining one of our support groups, because that is where we learn so much information about specialists. We share information about, yeah, we really liked this lady, she was great, or we really like this guy, he might be the best option. So we share that in our support groups. That's a great place to get information, is from other patients or from the support group leaders. And I know all support group leaders would welcome anyone into their groups to help answer these questions and to get more education on myeloma. So I guess we already had a little discussion about this, but if somebody wanted to find a local support group, how does a newly diagnosed person, where's the first place they would look for that? So I live in Boise, Idaho. It wasn't too hard for me to find one because Sherry, our leader, had a nice bulletin board in my doctor in the oncologist's office. There was a little piece of paper stuck there, diagnosed recently with myeloma, call this number. So I did, almost to tears, telling Sherry my story, and I quickly joined that support group. I had my walker for 4 months after having my surgery. I went, stumbling in with my walker. One of the best decisions I made, along with seeing a specialist. It was going to the support group. So if I'm trying to seek out a support group, how do I go about doing that, Sherry? What advice do you give?
Well, in the beginning, I was resistant to support groups because I thought I don't need a support group. Support groups just for people who are sad and they want to share their sad story. And but what I came to realize is that support groups are about education and empowerment. the more you know, the more you know, and the better you can advocate for yourself. So I happen to, in my case, maybe 6, 7 years ago, went to a patient gathering in Florida, and they talked about support groups, and that's where I met somebody from the IMF and got the idea in my head to start a support group. But as far as finding them, I mean, one, you can Google support groups in my area, and chances are something may or may not pop up. But if you go to myeloma.org and the MMRF, they both have search engines to find support groups in your area. Myeloma Crowd does as well. So if you go to Myeloma Crowd or healthtree.org, you can search for a support group in your area. Now, because of COVID, like Myeloma Crowd, their support groups are all virtual. So you could attend one virtually on a topic or an area that you live in that you would choose. But with myeloma, with the International Myeloma Foundation, I would say most of the support groups are still meeting virtually or doing hybrid meetings. So you could join one, even if you don't live close enough to attend one in person eventually. So I think that's a great resource for looking. So go to myeloma.org and you can find a support group that way.
Okay, thanks for that, Sherry. I know in our support group meetings, we spend more time telling stories and laughing. It's typically set up where we have an educational session, introductions of new members, and then we do spend time socializing and laughing. And even eventually we come to a point where we find a lot of humor in our diagnosis, believe it or not. So the support group has been a lifesaver for myself and my husband. So Craig, do you have anything to add to that? I know you joined the support group too, and finally got to meet everybody in person last week at the park. So anything
that was a lot of fun and fantastic. Yes. It's interesting how I found the support group, though. As you said early on, Lisa, when you're newly diagnosed, you're overwhelmed. There's terminology you don't know. There's this disease you hear that is incurable. You're truly overwhelmed. And one of the sites I went to just early on was Myeloma Crowd, which talked about finding a myeloma coach. And I didn't know what a myeloma coach was, but obviously it was a patient who had been through the process for many years, who has a lot more experience than a newly diagnosed patient does. And so I went on that myeloma coach website, and in Idaho, Sherry's name pops up. And I was like, perfect. I have someone that lives in Meridian, in a city right next to me. And so I reached out to Sherry because I had a lot of questions, and she was fantastic in answering all my questions. And from that introduction, invited me to the support group, which my wife and I have been participating in ever since. And so that's how I came across the support group.
So I'm going to move us forward to any patient questions that may have been submitted via chat or the Q&A function. So feel free to enter any of your questions. And if you wouldn't mind addressing your panelists by name, so we know if you have a question for specific panelists, that would be great, and we will answer those as our producers send them to us.
Well, thank you again to Sherry and Jack and Craig, who are now joining us live for our Q&A session of this program. We really appreciate you and all of you at home who are participating in our patient-centered program, where patients and care providers can ask questions of our myeloma patient panelists. We have received quite a few questions prior to beginning this program, so we will go through those questions. I'll begin with a couple of the ones we received earlier on, and we'll move through questions that come in through the Q&A or chat session. Those are going to be going through our producer. She'll review those and forward those on to me via text. So I'll be checking my phone occasionally, and we'll answer those questions throughout the program. Before we get started with that, though, I'm sure that many of you have heard that General Colin Powell passed away yesterday from complications of COVID. I think many of us, our ears tuned in when we also heard that he had multiple myeloma. I know I was interested in hearing more about that. Our condolences go out to his family as they work through this difficult time. But I think that brings up a couple of questions. As panelists and patients and a couple of support group leaders, I'm just curious what you are hearing out there. I know there was, the news has reported that he was fully vaccinated at the time of his passing. And then there were more discussions about his underlying condition of multiple myeloma and reports of having Parkinson's disease. What are you hearing among people in your support group or among oncologists in your community on how to handle vaccinations with multiple myeloma patients? I have heard things like the third dose of the vaccine is essential for people like us who have compromised immune systems. Can you, Sherry, maybe touch on that a little bit, what you've heard? I know you do a lot of research with some of these larger organizations also and hear on their reports. Can you touch on that a little bit, what you're hearing about vaccinations among the immunocompromised, especially myeloma patients?
Well, sure. Probably the biggest thing is get vaccinated, but act unvaccinated. Because even though, like, I'm in several studies checking the antibody levels, we don't know what those numbers mean. So even if you got what is considered the top reporting number for the antibody test, we still don't know what that means. And I think that the news is actually doing a good job of reporting that, yes, he was fully vaccinated. I don't think he'd received his third dose yet, but they're reporting how blood cancer patients and myeloma patients don't necessarily get the best benefit. So that's why you have a breakthrough case. That's why you have a death of somebody who was fully vaccinated. It's not that the vaccine doesn't work. It's that he was immune compromised and it didn't work as well for him as maybe it does for me or for you or for Craig or for Jack. So I think that's probably the most important thing, is that the news is trying to get that out, that we are all immune compromised, so we don't all get the same benefit. I think less than half of the myeloma patients are getting a good response to the vaccine because of their treatment, the status of their immune system. So the biggest takeaway, I think, is we still have to be careful. We still have to mask up in situations. If you're going to the grocery store, mask up. If you're going wherever it might be, that we have to act like maybe we're not vaccinated and be more careful. But I also think that we have to temper that with living our lives somewhat normally, because I think COVID is going to be around for years and we can't completely shut ourselves off from the world in our homes for years to come. We just have to figure out how to be super careful, get our vaccinations, get our boosters, get our third doses, and wear our masks.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Sherry. So I'm going to go back to a question also that came in prior to our program. One of our attendees or possible attendees is asking, and I'll direct this to Jack because you were diagnosed a while ago. When you were diagnosed, were there any tests that you wish you had done upon diagnosis, either you wish or one of your specialists wish they had access to now? Any tests that you might say that you wish you'd had done so patients who are newly diagnosed can take that forward to their care team?
Well, I wish the tests that we have today had been around in 1995. I can't tell you whether I was a high-risk patient or not because I didn't do FISH and cytogenetic studies on the bone marrow biopsy that you receive that they do today. And today they will look at the risk factors that you might have, and that might result in a different treatment plan than if you are just a standard risk patient. So I don't think there are really tests that I wish I had. I can tell you from Arkansas, they did the full boat of tests available back then, including gene studies and such, but we're also much further along today in kind of, again, understanding what to look at in terms of myeloma treatment.
Okay. And again, I think that was discussed during the program that seeing a specialist is pretty critical if you can do so, because they will do things like locally. I'm not sure that here in Idaho we do FISH testing upon diagnosis. That information is very important when it comes to treatment. Okay, so another question we have. All right, who might have had this done most recently? Probably Craig. What does a bone marrow biopsy feel like? Were you sedated, and what was it like afterward?
Well, as a matter of fact, I had one week ago, my fourth one since I was diagnosed. I had that one done at the University of Colorado. You can opt to get them with just a local sedation, basically, or sedation. And I, on all four of them, have elected to go with very light sedation. And I would recommend that to people. I don't think it's dangerous, and it makes the process go fantastic from a patient standpoint. I mean, I basically don't even feel the bone marrow biopsy happening. And so, kind of being in that light sedation is the way that I would recommend. You're a little tender afterwards for about a week, but the process itself is very easy.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. I'm going to look here online really quick. I think there's a support group question. Well, okay. This is a person who also submitted earlier on, and probably for Craig also, since it's more recent. This person is asking, the waiting for results from tests is agonizing. How long does it take for your results to come back for blood tests and for the bone marrow biopsy and for any scans you had? How long did you have to wait for those test results to come back?
Right. They come back relatively quickly, especially if you're online with like an Epic system at your hospital. I mean, you'll get those. I mean, for example, last week I was at the University of Colorado. I got all these tests done on Monday. By probably the end of the day on Monday, literally I probably had 25 different blood tests run. I probably had about half of them back. Some of them take a little bit longer. The M spike and some critical ones take a little bit longer. But I had the bone marrow biopsy back by the 4th, or I guess by the end of the week, by Friday. That one came back. 85-90% of my blood tests were back by Wednesday. Red and my doctor actually contacted me and set up a televisit to kind of go over results. So it is agonizing. I mean, you want them back instantaneously, but I'm amazed actually, but at least for me personally, how quickly they are coming back.
Okay, thank you, Craig.
Sure.
Okay, I have another question here. And I think, I'll read the question here. If you are diagnosed with MGUS, the doctor recommends just to test every 6 months. Is that the standard of care? Should we reach out to a specialist at this time? And I'll just remind everyone the goal of this program is to share our personal myeloma experiences. We are not able to give out any kind of medical advice. I would recommend personally reaching out to a specialist at that time, just so you have somebody in your network that you can rely on to follow your progress, or hopefully no progress with your MGUS. Jack, do you have any recommendations for this person?
Well, I think the doctor that recommends testing every 6 months, doing blood work, it makes sense. That's pretty standard. I also think that, he should be aware that there's been a lot of studies on MGUS, and the chances of MGUS progressing to full-blown myeloma is like 1% per year. So, in 25 years from now, there's a 25% chance that the person will have myeloma. So there's no treatment being done for MGUS at this stage. Rather, it's really a kind of a watch and monitor what's going on.
Okay, thanks, Jack. So we also have a comment made that this person was diagnosed in 2015 and is happy to hear about what others have gone through. It's very reassuring. That is one of the reasons we are doing this program, to hopefully provide some hope and some reassurance as you patients and care partners go through this experience. This person would like to join a support group in Rhode Island, if anyone knows of one. I think that one of the best ways to look up to see if there is a support group in Rhode Island is to go to myeloma.org. It's the International Myeloma Foundation. Sherry, is that correct? Would that be the best resource for this person to go and look up for support group?
Yeah, in fact, I sent him a little message with the link for that. So.
Oh, excellent. Okay, thank you. Okay. So another person has asked George, it looks like, Is it possible to have liquid biopsies from regular blood or serum to find myeloma markers I have to open up my phone, by using mass spectrometry? It is much more accurate. Now, this is something, there have been multiple webinars on that. Jack, do you have any information on that, where we're at with doing liquid biopsies rather than the with blood, rather than having to have bone marrow biopsies done to see the status of myeloma?
So there's continual work in developing liquid biopsy procedures, because it certainly would be better for all of us if we could avoid doing bone marrow biopsies. This is in particular for MRD, or minimum residual disease assessment, which is a more sensitive technique for knowing how much myeloma is in your body. Work on using mass spec is primarily right now being developed out of the Mayo Institute. It's not readily available for other patients. It's not quite as provide as much detail in most cases as a bone marrow biopsy can provide, but it does provide better results than the SPEP or IFE test that we take for our blood. So it's, gonna come down the road so that other facilities will have the chance to do mass spectrometry, and we'll have to wait and see when it's available.
Thank you, Jack. I know I am hopeful that 5 years from now, we're all doing well and we have the ability to have blood drawn, no more bone marrow biopsies. Crossing my fingers that that happens. I received a question via email that I will answer here, because this is about our personal experiences. Says, be honest. We talk about all these strategies and helpful tips and how to remain positive, but are there times when you feel utterly overwhelmed, ready to give up, and not at all positive? I don't want to know what to do about it. I just want to know how you feel about your disease. Don't sugarcoat it. It's kind of my nature to probably sugarcoat. That might be why she made that comment. I do try to employ strategies to stay positive with regular exercise and having a gratitude journal that hasn't been touched in probably 6 months. But I think a lot of us try to appear positive, hoping that maybe our positive feelings will follow when we're having a tough day. But that's not your question. I guess the question is, are there days when it feels utterly overwhelming? And the answer is yes. There are hours and days sometimes that can be exhausting. And I personally will feel overwhelmed with my disease and with the side effects and the symptoms, and thinking about my future and my children and my husband. And I think on those days, you didn't ask for strategies, that sometimes I'll just sit and hope that that feeling passes, and it typically does. I do know that this question is from a woman whose husband was diagnosed with myeloma. They have young children at home, and it has taken a toll on her and her family. I feel that myeloma is cancer. We know that there's not a cure yet, and that toll can be felt by everyone around you. It can be felt, you feel it as a patient, but it is felt by your care partners, by your family. It definitely can take a toll. And I guess the only thing that I would have to offer is to try to seek out one small faction of your support network, whether it's your best friend or a community of faith, or maybe a social worker at your local cancer center. We have an amazing support group here locally. We do find a lot of friendships and a lot of support with that group. So yes, the answer is yes. There are days, as much as we seem to look normal and feel normal, everything has changed, and that can take a toll. So for our care providers, especially, that toll is pretty heavy, and sometimes that seems like it's too heavy of a burden. So to our care providers, you're doing a great job, and hang in there. You're doing awesome. So I know who wrote this, so I thought I would address that. So another question is, and I think maybe if we have time, all of the panelists can briefly answer this question. Has your doctor ever said what might have caused your myeloma? And do you have any ideas on what could have caused it? I know there are theories out there, and I'll just address the 4 theories I've heard are could be hereditary. It could be an environmental factor. It could be a random mutation, or it could be a viral or illness trigger. It could be viral or illness triggered. My doctor down, my specialist down in Houston, she kind of looks at all of those. I know when I went down there, I filled out a very extensive questionnaire asking where I was born, where I grew up, where I lived, how many years I spent there. And one of the things that was targeted in particular was Agent Orange. So I do not have exposure to Agent Orange, but I know environmental toxins are something that are being studied right now. So I'll just ask Sherry, I don't know what caused my myeloma. There's no smoking gun either for me or for my specialist. Sherry, have your doctors ever indicated their thoughts on what might have caused your myeloma? And have you ever thought back to yourself, what could have caused this?
Oh, I definitely thought back. And it was maybe a year into my diagnosis when I don't even remember how I heard about it, but there was water contamination issues at Camp Lejeune Marine Corps Base in North Carolina, where I was stationed with my family as a young girl. I was probably 7 to 9 years old or 8 to 10 years old. We were there for almost 2 years. And there's been a huge study about cancers caused from that water contamination. Myeloma happens to be one of them. I was the oldest of 5 kids. I'm the only one so far, and I was diagnosed at 49, and everybody's past the 49-year-old mark, but I'm the only one in the family so far that has myeloma. There's no way to know for sure. There's just speculation that it could have caused it. And other than that, I don't have any idea. Bad luck.
All right, thanks, Sherry. How about briefly you, Craig, any thoughts on cause? Have you ever speculated what could have caused your myeloma?
I wish I knew. I really don't know. Neither do my doctors. There's no blood cancers at all in my family history. Doctors kind of went through what they probably went through with everyone else. Was I in the military, exposed to any chemicals, the petroleum industry? The answer to all those were no. So it's a mystery. I really have no idea, and neither do my doctors, what caused my myeloma.
Okay, Jack, any thoughts?
Same answer as Craig. There are some things that are known to be causative factors. Craig alluded to Agent Orange in the military. It's also well known that folks that helped and worked in the Twin Towers collapse and such have been diagnosed with more blood cancers and myeloma specifically. There are some genetic factor involved in myeloma that the PROMISE study out of Dana-Farber is investigating. So, and it's normal for everybody to ask, how did I get this? But in general, we don't know.
Okay, thank you, Jack. So I think we have time for one more question. I see a question in the chat, and I think I will try to summarize what they're asking, that this person has same myeloma case, different treatment ideas from the same doctor, and other doctors have different thoughts on that. Some said to stop treatments and some said to keep the treatments. So my suggestion, I guess, or my thoughts on that, I know having gone to a couple of specialists, Craig has done the same. Myeloma is a very complicated disease. And I think for as many doctors you go to, it is likely you'll get that many different treatment options. And it's really working together with your team and making decisions that are best for yourself and your family to decide on treatment and treatment options. So I think, Jack, do you have anything to add to that also, as far as having, I know you interact with a lot of people, and then we'll close with that. Different doctors, same doctors, different treatments. It all can be very confusing. Any words of advice or wisdom?
If you go to enough myeloma conferences, which I do, even the doctors will say, if you ask three myeloma expert doctors, what should I do? You'll get 5 different opinions. So unfortunately, myeloma is not at a stage where we have precision therapy, look at your type of myeloma and tell me what will work best for it. The best advice I can always give is to see if clinical trials are available for your myeloma, whether you're newly diagnosed or a relapsed patient, because that's how we learn about better treatments for this disease. And down the road, we will understand this disease better to be able to recommend best treatments.
Great, thank you, Jack. And it does look like we are out of time with our Q&A. I know there are a couple of more questions. I will be checking with our producer to see if we can copy those questions and post some responses online at Patient Empowerment Network, which is powerfulpatients.org. A big thank you to Jack, Sherry, and Craig. And for those of you at home, thank you for listening in and participating. Our Path to Empowerment program will be an ongoing series where patients or anyone affected by myeloma can dialogue with others. So please check our website for any future programs. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I wish you many good days on your myeloma journey and hope to see you at our next patient panel program.